So, welcome to TITUBANTI TESTI 8. This is the last binomio of our series, and it is a particular pleasure to welcome two dear colleagues and friends, such as Serafina Cuomo, who is joining us from Durham University, and Edward Watts from University of San Diego. They are both professors in ancient history, and they share a strong interest in history of science. And the thing is that I wasn't able to circulate the text, sorry, because I was traveling in the last days, so I was a little bit confused. I was looking actually for an Italian translation, but I mean, this is the reason why. But I'm so happy. Also because of the text itself, which is so very well known to many of us, as I was telling before, this text is actually has been much studied in Italy, and it is almost a canonical reading. There is something of a paradox in it because it seems to go against our our own discipline in a way. And but it reminds us how important important things are, and this is always a pleasure to reread this this very Senecan letter. Okay, so I think we can start. I guess Ed, this is your first time in our group. So the thing is, I don't introduce people, and I always ask to say something, especially, I mean, not about your career, which is of course very very long, but if you can say something why this text particularly attracted your attention, and Serafina will tell us why she proposed the text. So as you might have understood at this point, Serafina is the one who proposed the text, and Ed is the one who accepted to discuss this particular epistle to 88. So Ed, yours is the floor.
Great. Well, thank you, Marco. I'm really glad to do this, and I will. I'm going to share my screen if I can figure out how to do it. Okay. So I will start by just saying at the outset, I'm going to start with a confession. I don't like Seneca. I don't like Seneca I really don't like Seneca. I read him as an undergraduate. I didn't like his style. In a reading group I was in a few years ago, I really grew to hate his pretensions of modesty when I studied a sequence of his letters. And right now I'm working on a history of Rome from the beginning to the end. And so for the first time in my life, I've spent some time looking at the reign of Nero. And I have to say, I really don't like the retrograde attitudes that Seneca embodied as he tried to keep an Italian senatorial aristocracy in power while the imperial Senate was basically struggling to be reborn as a more ecumenical body. So in short, there's a lot about Seneca that I don't like. And Epistle 88, I think, embodies some of the things I don't like about Seneca. So when we first when this was first suggested to me, I reread the letter, and I reread it quickly initially to try reinforce or to try to see if my perspective on it has changed. And what I saw in essence is an argument that I didn't particularly agree with that looks really compelling. But once you dig into it, and once you sort of think about it in the context of a modern environment, I think that it actually becomes even more distasteful. So Epistle 88, when it's summarized, and when we see sort of our students talking about it, it says in essence that the liberal arts mostly are worthless because they're at best preparatory tools for the study of philosophy and training in virtue. But really what they're doing is kind of wasting time and space in your soul so that you can't genuinely focus on what's really important, which is virtue. There's of course more to the letter than that. Seneca speaks at some length about why other liberal studies are inferior to philosophy. Poetry gives you tools to understand meter, not meaning. Mathematics allows you to mark out an estate and measure a circle, but no ability to measure what matters for a man or how to sketch out the boundaries of a good life. And art, physical activity, and pleasure and cooking are just for pleasure. So on one level, as Marco suggests, this is a kind of paradoxical text because it doesn't seem to really value or uphold the sorts of things that we do in our professional life. Um, but on another level, there are some wonderful sound bites in this. So, for example, Seneca tells us, I respect no study, deem no study good, which results in money making. Such studies, he continues, are profit bringing occupations, useful only insofar as they give the mind a preparation and don't engage it permanently. And one should linger upon them only so long as the mind can occupy itself with nothing greater because they're not our real work. So, superficially, this seems to provide a really compelling justification for why humanistic studies should be encouraged rather than shunted to the side so that students can learn something like this business economics, this major that now dominates so many US universities. And so Seneca is really your man. If you want to find some sort of ancient quote that you could recite to a dean at a university reception or a tech bro talking about why his venture capital funding at a cocktail party is going to change the world. Because Seneca's statement is powerful and the argumentation, at least superficially, is compelling. But the problem I have with this letter is that we and Seneca both, in theory, agree that studies should not simply be about how we can make money. And therefore, we feel like we should like his argument, but we shouldn't. It's not a good argument, nor is it one that leads us to a place that produces the sort of virtuous learning that I think we all desire. And in fact, if we analyze it a little more deeply, a peculiarly Senecan arrogance infects it to such a degree that I think we need to find something else to use in order to justify our own work to these outsiders who, deep down, probably don't think we do something that's terribly valuable. So I want to start with a bit of a thought exercise. What happens if we modernize the type of argument that Seneca makes to justify the study of philosophy to the exclusion of mathematics, art, philology, history, and just about anything else anybody in antiquity or now might find interesting? If we're reducing the argument to his most basic and fundamental point, Seneca effectively says that you'll be worn out by the vast number of things to be answered and learned. And not only will you be exhausted, but you'll use up space in your mind and be unable to actually fill it up with virtuous ideas. So, in order that these manifold and mighty subjects might have free space in your soul, Seneca writes, you must remove all superfluous things from it because virtue will not surrender itself to our narrow boundaries. Instead, Seneca continues, virtue requires a great and wide space in which to move, and we should drive all other things out so our emptied hearts can receive and be filled by virtue. And so, a mind full of liberal arts is to Seneca like a room full of expensive but useless furniture or a library full of books that we need to cut down with an axe. And so we need to measure the years of our lives, and when we do that, we'll see that they have no room in them for all of these things. So even if we can forgive the wandering metaphors, so I mean, who after all uses an axe to cull books from their library or even get rid of furniture from an overcrowded room, we're still left with an argument based on a set of images. So in effect, Seneca is saying the liberal arts might be interesting, they might be fun, but we have neither the time nor the mental storage capacity to waste on them. So while it's interesting to consider whether Homer is older than Hesiod or how the scansion of a line of poetry works, our life is finite, our brains have a finite storage capacity, and we just can't spare the megabytes necessary to store data about Homer when we need to reserve that storage space for virtue. So this is the same argument that university administrators use against people like us right now. Classics, they say, is interesting and our students might enjoy studying it, but it's not useful because it doesn't lead to what our administrators deem to be productive employment or large government grants or lucrative patents that our universities can share or exciting new ways to buy pet food over the internet that might lead to gifts to our endowment funds. And so classics professors make less money than computer scientists or economists who administrators feel do something useful. On my campus, classics professors do not get priority in the rooms in which they teach, the admission slots that are extended to students, the library resources they would like to order in order to do their research, and the funding necessary to support their projects. The argument is again, there are finite resources. And while the administration would like to fund everybody, administrators must must prioritize those studies that lead to the outcomes they believe are most useful and beneficial. So our administrators embrace a form of bureaucratic progress measured through metrics like high earning careers for students, companies that go public, or grants that pay for administrator salaries. So probably everybody in this meeting and everybody listening to this has at least once heard from a university leader that our work may be interesting, but space and time is limited, and other more essential disciplines must take priority over classics. This is the modern twist on Seneca's argument. And it's one that lives in the form letters we receive to regretfully inform us we didn't get a grant, or our appeal for graduate funding was denied, or a class was not given a large auditorium despite its long wait list because the economics department asked for the room instead of us. Sometimes university administrators even make this argument to our faces. So a few years ago, I attended a fundraising dinner that included significant donors and faculty members who worked on projects related to antiquity, as well as some senior administrators. I won't name the administrator involved, but you probably can figure out this person is quite highly placed and not one of the classics faculty. In the course of this dinner, one of these administrators asked why anybody should fund work focused primarily on antiquity. The question was framed like this. What's the point of funding the study of antiquity? I mean, isn't everything good from antiquity already baked into our society if it was worth knowing at all? And obviously, no one needs to spend any time on money and things that we don't use now. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this fundraising dinner was not a rousing success after he said this. But the line of thinking that prompted this question is not much different from that advanced by Seneca nearly 2,000 years earlier. Both my administrator and my least favorite ancient philosopher believe that there's limited space for knowledge, and that knowledge must be curated in such a way that what is useful now is given time, attention, and resources. And things that are merely interesting or instrumental in our progress towards a greater goal are to be discarded, because unfortunately, storage space and attention spans are limited, and we must always privilege the knowledge that produces the best return. What arrogance there is for someone to presume that they, and only they, have the prerogative to determine what knowledge is worth investing time and resources in preserving and advancing. None of us sitting in that donor meeting agreed with the administrator who dismissed all ancient learning as either baked into the present or irrelevant to anything that matters. And yet some of us are still enchanted by Seneca, even though he's no less rash and dismissive of vast swaths of knowledge. But we shouldn't be. Both Seneca and my administrator friend appointed themselves judges of what is valuable, based solely upon what interests them now, and then slammed down the gavel, dismissing the case for anything else being worth anyone else's time or energy. But what if they're right? What if, in fact, there are limited resources, and we as individuals and members of society need to privilege only those things that are most valuable, blessed, if we don't, the quality of our world will gradually erode away. So I think all of us with any kind of role in university administration are fully aware that yes, university resources of space, time, and money are finite. And in Seneca's world, I think we would all agree that the limiting factors of ill health, public duties, private duties, daily duties, and sleep were real as well. But finite resources just mean we need to be more efficient in using everything that we can. No field of study can remain vibrant without contact with other fields of study and with other knowledge, because genuine knowledge does not come simply from pure, elemental, and monolithically disciplinary ideas. It instead grows out of wide interdisciplinary study through which a large number of diverse ideas, intellectual approaches, and pieces of information blend together until they create complicated, beautiful intellectual compounds. The appropriate metaphor for the study of virtue, then, is not Seneca's cluttered sitting room, where so many kernels of pure philosophical knowledge can fit. It's instead an image of a metallurgist's smelter that builds strong, brilliant alloys by catalyzing reactions that blend together many different compounds. What starts out as a batch of discrete elements emerges as something better, stronger, and more vibrant than any of those individual parts. And this is what liberal arts do to and for philosophy. Seneca dismisses pre-Socratic thinkers like Parmenides and Zeno of Elea and effectively throws up his hands about what to do with their work. But there's a different, much more productive path that's much more consistent with the open-minded interdisciplinary ways in which we now work. Like Seneca, the 6th century AD Neoplatonist Simplicius knew and read Parmenides and Zeno and Plato and Aristotle, and he even wrote a commentary on the Stoic handbook of Epictetus. But unlike Seneca, Simplicius found what was useful in all of these works and continued to engage critically with them to deepen and enhance his own philosophical understanding. He was creating compounds. But his works go even beyond this rich appreciation of the philosophical past to embrace other materials like those dismissed by Seneca. So his commentaries also reference calendar traditions from Athens, Syria, Asia Minor, and Rome. He talks about boats that sail on the Mesopotamian rivers. They speak about his own experiences as well as his own teachers. But these things are not ornate and useless furniture cluttering a room. They're instead explanatory tools introduced in the service of higher philosophical truth. Simplicius worked towards a sort of practical ethics that is rigorous and very much geared towards the world in which Simplicius lived, and this required him to know about and make use of as much of that world as he was able to understand. And this is an approach to philosophy that I wholeheartedly endorse. It's the answer that I gave to my administrator when he claimed there was nothing useful still to learn from antiquity because it was all baked into what we already know. Even if we accept the dubious premise that everything now is built only on what is worthwhile in the past, knowledge is produced by reacting in new ways to ideas from the past that we now use, or resurrecting old ideas that once might have been discarded because we didn't know enough to appreciate their full implications. Democritus, for example, might have been nothing more than a curiosity to Seneca, but his old discarded notion of atomic theory proved pretty useful when it was combined with more modern forms of empirical observation. Because knowledge grows exponentially as we experiment with how different, unrelated, and antiquated notions might interact with each other. This is why there needs to remain a place in universities for the humanities, and it's also why we should leave Seneca aside and instead embrace Simplicius when deans, administrators, and tech bros ask us what they should read. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this tirade and also for reminding us how miserable we are as classicists, dear Ed. Now, this was very interesting. I always wanted to organize a conference with the title Bad Classics, like inviting people to finally express their anger the way you expressed right now against a classical text. I think this is liberating, and this is something which we should also do as an exercise. Why should we also always admire the object of our studies, right? So this is a very frank reaction to boring Seneca. And so I like this. Thank you so much. And now, of course, we are very eager to learn what Serafina has to tell us, the one who proposed this text.
So thank you very much. I want to start by saying I don't like Seneca either. I strongly dislike him. And every time I read something else by him that I haven't read before, I kind of admire, the way he puts an argument together. It's always very subtle, but I end up hating him even more than before. So we're completely on the same page with this. Why did I choose this text? It's been haunting me ever since I came across it while working on mathematics, because I think that it is basically about mathematics. I mean, I think if one is looking for a systematic discussion of the liberal arts, a trivium and a quadrivium, we'd be disappointed. Seneca doesn't list the disciplines that he's talking about systematically. He has no discussion of logic or rhetoric. He has a little about music, a bit more of astronomy, but most attention is paid to arithmetic and geometry. And one of the things that fascinated me from the first time I came across the text is, why is he so strongly against them? So why does he hate mathematics so much? And the answer I think I'm giving to it is because Seneca was, among other things, an enslaver, and so I think that the way in which freedom and the lack of freedom figures in the text intersects very nicely with the two key concepts that Ed also identified, which are time and space. Because freedom is also about having a lot of time, well, at least time that you spend on things you want to spend time on, and space. And the fact that Seneca is playing with these two things in connection with freedom, I think also highlights the presence of people who don't have time, don't have space, and don't have freedom. So the way I approach the text, Marco, could you share the screen with sections 1 and 2? As a good historian of science rather than a philologist, I've kind of tried to look at two levels, an epistemological level and a kind of sociological level, which, you know, is a fundamental tenet of the history of science, that the two are always connected. So I want to look at what Seneca has to say about knowledge and what he has to say about the people who embody, or in fact don't embody, the knowledge that he's talking about. I'm very conscious of the time, so I may skip over a few things, but sections 1 and 2, the very beginning, set the tone for the rest of the letter by you know, bringing up some contrasts. One is between sapientia, which is sublime, is strong, not childlike, and all the other things, particularly things as they are taught by teachers who are supposedly figures not just of authority, but of moral authority. Already in sections 1 and 2, there's a lot of attention paid to time and how one spends it. Liberal studies are a temporary pursuit, and here we find verbs like non detinent, in morandum est, which already suggest that the time should be spent otherwise or elsewhere. This will come back in section 33 towards the end, and it seems to me that on the theme of time and to some extent space, the whole letter has a kind of ring composition about it. Seneca also here introduces the theme of work, and so implicitly of workers, by ruling out the possibility of money at the end of the study. And that's the sentence that, in fact, Ed had on a slide. Obviously, it's a luxury to be able to spend one's time not in a way that brings money. You can only do it if you don't need money. So that's already this distinction. It's already a kind of distinction between people who can afford to spend their time in a certain way, and people who have no choice but to spend their time trying to get money. So we could already see a link between study and freedom established straight away, and also implicitly lack of freedom, lack of time, and so lack of ability to study in a way that's not aimed at something else. And another buzzword here is also bonum as a noun and as an adjective, vir bonus. Seneca clearly assumes that he knows about the good, and that studying should be about the good, since it's not about money. So he sets the scene. I want to skip forward to section 10, if we can do that. I can't remember what page it's on. There it is. Thank you. So let's start with the knowledge level. So the kind of epistemological discourse here. It seems to me that Seneca's discussion of the mathematical disciplines stands out. I think that there is real target, and also the main competition for the form of knowledge or of education that he advocates. I know that he starts discussing grammar. Well, I assume it's grammar. He focuses on Homeric exegesis, on deliberately minor points, but I'm very struck by the fact that even when he talks about grammar, a lot of mathematical points come up, like the age of some of the characters, or where Odysseus actually wandered, which could be seen as geography. Later on in section 39, he goes back onto this point again that width of ring composition, to say, to talk about how one might but should not calculate years. Even the Homeric reception anecdote in section 40 and 41 is in fact a numerological quiz. So I feel that this is really about math, and that's why we skip into section 10 to 13, which are on the page here, where you got 10 and 11, and then we'll get to 13 in a minute. So in section 10, we start with geometry, which is in the form of land surveying. We then have arithmetic with the mention of finger counting, accounting, and then land surveying again, then more generally geometry, then astronomy. Compared to the others, as I said, there is a circularity to it, but also there's a sense in which the real world intrudes upon the text. And what is made very clear is the economic underpinning of the lifestyle of people like Seneca himself, because you see that he talks about the latifundia. And in fact, later on, he'll also use some images drawn from real estate. So it seems to me that while highlighting freedom, not being aimed at money at all, is not unaware of the fact that his freedom is underpinned by the fact that as a senator, he would have met property qualifications, and probably would have been one of the owners of the latifundia that he mentions here. So there's this kind of, real life coming up in a discourse that otherwise tries to be devoid, abstract from real life. From the first sentence onwards, there's a sort of escalation. Counting is presented as aimed at avaritia, then not even that, because it's described as completely pointless, reinforced by the use of supervacua, a kind of keyword in this letter later on. And the discourse is shifted from the good to happiness, which is introduced through the contrast between feliciorem and infelicissimus. What I find extraordinary in this sentence is also that there is an underlying presence of other people. The tabulari are mentioned, who are worn out by the property administration needs of the wealthy men. But note that tabulari would also be the people working in the public administration. And at this point in time, they often were imperial slaves or formerly enslaved people. So there is, I think, a kind of we use the word paradoxical. I think that's quite a good word to use about this letter. This kind of contrast between the need to have this administration that is mathematical and at the same time a rejection of it. There is a further reference to emotional response. And then there's also, and I think this is in the next page, what may be read as a critique of land ownership, if not even a critique of imperialism. This is also the first time, I think, where Seneca here uses ars to talk about the liberal studies. He continues to do so in section 18. This is followed by astrology. I want to talk a lot about it. And then in sections, between section 24 and 28, if we could go to those briefly. This is, I'll skip some of this, but it is in these sections that land surveying is invoked again, and is framed within a wider cosmological setting. And in sections, I got this written down, 27, I think, Seneca uses an unusual metaphor to do with building, the idea of fundamentum, the idea of owning, building something on your own land or someone else's land, which is a strange image. It seems to me that he wasn't obliged to use an image again based, drawn from real estate, the economic side of things, and instead he does. And this is underscored, in my view, by Seneca himself, because he says ut ita dicam, but in fact it already paved the ground for this image by this discussion of land ownership in section 12. So the knowledge level is a bit messier than what might have expected. Some disciplines are given more weight than others. And instead of talking a lot, as one might have expected, about more, I don't know, abstract aspects of mathematics like geometry more generally, Seneca chooses to attack forms of mathematics that specifically underpin the economic foundation of lifestyles such as his. I then now want to move to the people level. Let's try to populate this letter. Alongside the discussion of forms of knowledge, Seneca also arguably discusses people, both the practitioners of the liberal arts and teachers of the liberal arts. More implicitly, people who play a role in making our knowledge possible. If we go back to the tabulary of section 10, please. It seems to me, in a sentence that's a bit convoluted, it's so small that I can't read, but if you could, the sentence where he talks about tabulari, it seems to me that Seneca is saying that the wealthy man would be very unhappy indeed if he was put in the position where he was forced, cogitur, to calculate how much he possesses per se by himself. This is a further twist on the situation. It seems to me that Seneca acknowledges that there are other people who have to calculate how much people possess, and the job that they do, thanks to the kind of mathematics that Seneca is basically attacking, is what makes their lifestyle possible. And they wouldn't want to be in the shoes of someone who has to do that. But at the same time, it's necessary that someone does that. That's a paradox. The people who make this lifestyle possible are not just the public tabulari, but the household administrators of possessions, the vilici, for instance, if we want to look at what is said in agricultural treatises. If we go back to section 25, I think the sentence multa adjuvant nos nec ideo partes nostri sunt can be read again on more than one level. It's about knowledge and thus epistemological. It is couched in semi-legalistic terms, but when you think of the context, it can also apply to people. People like Seneca or his circle had lots of helpers, including helpers who, as recently explored by, among others, Joe Hawley, played very important roles in their literary creations. Is an enslaved secretary who copies a philosophy book and thus also reads it also on the way to virtus and so free. I'm very struck by the food metaphor here because, contrary to what Seneca says, food does become a part of the body. And also, I find that embodied metaphors are often deployed when talking about hierarchical relationships where the few needs the many. So think of Menenius Agrippa in Livy, think of Frontinus, the hands and the head. To find a body metaphor in a place where you wouldn't expect it, and I wouldn't expect it here in a discussion of liberal arts, rings all sorts of bells about the social hierarchies that are being reinforced. In section 31, which I believe is on the next page, and I think it's one of the ones that Ed was discussing, we find another apparent contradiction which Seneca needs to resolve. How is it that liberal studies are necessary to attain virtue, and yet they do not contribute anything to virtue? Seneca goes into food again, and then talks about the wood and ships. And here again, bells are ringing in the direction of what else in Seneca's word was necessary, but not admitted to the top of the hierarchy. It's also metaphysical reflection, what is doing, on the impossibility of social change. Like liberal arts, enslaved or socially subordinate people were aids to the attainment of knowledge, both in relieving people like Seneca of the necessity of measuring their estates or counting their money, and in participating even more directly in literary production. What Seneca says here could apply to enslaved assistants too. They are needed, but not to be dwelled upon. When he says in section 31, non est inquam, cur aliquid putes eius adiutorio fieri, sine quo non potest fieri, this sentence to me is a kind of sinister ring, and I don't believe it. I think it's actually not true. I think the opposite is true. It's this assertion to me seems unreasonable, and it's exactly the fact that it seems unreasonable that makes me think that this is not just about epistemology, but about a social order which, despite its occasional flights of fancy into, the brotherhood of mankind, Seneca has no intention of undermining. Is, in this sense, I think profoundly conservative. Another point on which I agree with Ed. He criticizes private property, for instance, only to use it as gatekeeping a few sections later. So to conclude, it's interesting to compare Seneca's discussion of liberal studies with similar ones. For instance, we have one in Quintilian, his contemporary, in Institutio Oratoria 110, for instance. And Quintilian assumes that his readers will know of the Encyclios Paideia, discusses in particular music and geometry. He thinks that the ideal orator should know the liberal arts, and some of his examples cover the same ground as Seneca's. Another term of comparison, I'll limit myself to two, is Galen's Protrepticon, later than Seneca. In that text, Galen goes as far as enlisting not only Homer, but also Socrates and Plato among the attendants of the god Hermes. Both Quintilian and Galen, who were practitioners of an ars, are much more explicit about the fact that this is not just about knowledge, but about people. It seems to me that this is more implicit, but looming large in Seneca's letter too, and that the people in question are not just practitioners or teachers of liberal arts, but people who, despite being proficient in the liberal arts and mathematical arts in particular, are not free. Not necessarily metaphorically. The unspoken presence here is, I think, of enslaved and socially subordinate people. And the very definition, domain of the term liberal arts kind of points in that direction. I think this suggestion is reinforced by Seneca's insistence in the letter on things that enslaved or socially subordinate people don't have: freedom, time, and space even concretely as real estate. Even the most metaphysical part of the letter, section 34, seems obsessed with freedom. In section 45, it's about time. In section 33 and 35, it's about the space. Seneca says in 33 that Sapientia needs space. It needs empty space. And again, I think real estate. In section 35, he talks about the soul breaking free from prison and wandering around. And again, Virtus needs lots of space and cannot be had in a narrow space, angustias, which is a very concrete term. And, again, about the supervacua and what is necessary and what isn't. In some, Seneca's take on liberal arts is, I think, unusual and surprising. He redefines what they mean to some extent. It goes beyond the mos maiorum He's not advocating a return to the ways of old. That much is clear. And after critiquing mathematics, he even in fact embraces measuring. What is, however, not surprising is that for Seneca, knowledge, proper knowledge, sapientia, is not for everybody. Liberal arts are for the free. Sapientia requires a freedom, time, and apparently space. His seems to me is an explicit call to marginalize some types of people along with some types of knowledge. I think this is an investment in an exclusionary epistemology, also because he's invested in socially excluding the corresponding epistemic agents, even if he acknowledges that they are the foundation on which his own world is built. And I finish there.
Let me go back to the, okay. Good, Serafina, great, thank you so much. So many interesting points and such a profound reading of this letter. I never noticed all this detail. This is yeah, this is amazing. Thank you so much. And Ed, I usually give the opportunity to the first speaker to give a brief statement, to say something, if you would like to comment. And then I will ask, in the meanwhile, participants who would like to ask a question or simply, to intervene, to say something. You shouldn't have a question, just a question. You can also just add something, another commentary. If you could make yourself visible with your hands, or either virtual hand or real hands. Okay, Ed.
Yeah, Serafina, I love that. I think that your reading of this is really, it's really spectacular to think about the way that marginalizing knowledge also marginalizes people. And it also, especially when knowledge is practical, marginalizes the people deploying that knowledge in a practical context. And I think that the way that you point out the apparent awareness in Seneca that the way of life that he's advocating for is totally contingent on a structure of society that depends on the labor of socially excluded people or socially marginalized people, I think is absolutely, it's really spectacular. It's really eye-opening. I think the one thing that I would maybe even elaborate on a little more is the idea of what resources these people work from. I think that a lot of the work that's recently been done on the banking system in Rome in particular, and the fact that, a huge portion of the money that Romans possess actually dwells in accounts that are holders of, held financial instruments. They literally can't know what they have. They're depending on Argentarii and others to maintain those accounts, to trade on those accounts, to invest their money. In the same way that, that say if one of us had a trust fund, we would have no idea how that money actually works. We would expect somebody to make it work for us and we would depend on it, but we would have no idea what's actually going on. And so it wouldn't be about counting, it would just be about like the basic recognition of like what even the stuff is that we live off of. So I think that's really fascinating. And I think that it's actually something I had never considered before. That there could be a marginalization of people based on the marginalization of the skills they possess. So I really thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know. Is there more that I should say, or?
Yes, feel free, because there is no other other sign. Christiana would like to say something, maybe, or. We have another 10 minutes, so it's okay. Christiana, would you like to say something?
Yes, I have a comment, but I would like to hear what what and if Ed has any further comments.
No, I think that I'd love to hear what Christiana has to say. So.
Okay. No, first of all, I want to thank you both, because this was like a masterclass, and I'm so happy with having learned so much, and Ed, I know now what to tell Deans and Serafina. I absolutely, as Ed said, I also had never considered the agents in the letter, and so thank you for populating the letters actually for us. The question that I had, since we are all piling on Seneca, I'm happy to join the club. What always struck me so much in this letter is the uncurious mind setup that it promotes. So it's, Seneca, I'm sort of interested in the sort of history of curiosity, or Greco-Roman ideas about curiosity. And Seneca is not someone who actually talks about it, but by implication he does. And especially, like these tirades against people who waste their time on useless knowledge seems to me to invite people to be uncurious, because if you are curious about knowledge, you are wasting your time. So I just wanted to put that out there and see what your thoughts are.
I love that. I think that I would even go so far as to say that following in Serafina's direction, the lack of curiosity, I think, is a power move. It's in a sense an assertion of a sort of social structure that doesn't need to be challenged or investigated because you're just comfortable where it is. And so I think that by putting people in this letter, we can see the lack of curiosity, which I think Christiane is quite real, but we can also see why that arrogance might exist, right? If we are talking about people who possess a skill that Seneca doesn't care about, and he also doesn't care about those people, and we know who those people are, we can see why there is a lack of curiosity. It's like a fundamental arrogance that I think is even more striking when you can put faces to the ideas that he's dismissing. But Serafina, I'll defer to you on the.
I think, it kind of took the words out of my mouth. I know this is, I was so happy, Ed, that you took this thing that people do these days of, using Seneca as the good guy to, defend that position and turn it around completely, because I think, that's like the perfect reading of how Seneca should be used to kind of, articulate our position as scholars of antiquity in the world today. I'm kind of baffled how many people identify with Seneca. I don't know if it's the suicide thing, the kind of hero of philosophy that draws the crowds. But yeah, the kind of selective lack of curiosity is interesting, particularly because if you read then bits from the natural questions, it'd be like, oh, you have to be curious about everything, and then no, you're not. That is not an entirely consistent position. Not that it has to be, but yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how he's very ready to kind of negate that in other contexts.
Yeah, it is very, before giving the word to Craig, I just wanted to add, it is a pity that actually no colleagues from Italy, I do see Italians here, of course, the majority of us are from Italy, but not Italians from Italy. And, as I was telling before, when I introduced you guys, this particular letter, and of course, Seneca in general, is like an absolute authority. I myself come from a certain school where Seneca was really taught. And I saw my colleague here, Rita, but she left for some reason. This is a pity, because we would like also to have the other opinion. And it is interesting because in Italy right now there is this reaction against the debate going on in the United States, in the UK, to academic worlds, of course, that you both represent. And they are preoccupied about this cancel culture. There is a lot of discussion about that. But I do think that talking very highly critically about, such authorities from the ancient times is by no means a sign of, a sign of canceling them, but it is to discussing them. I mean, in a current setting. Okay, Craig, would you like to say something? I saw your hand.
Oh yeah, yeah. Just when Serafina, actually both of you, I would just like to hear if either of you have any thoughts when we're talking about the presence of, or the opposition between free and slave, right? And of course, we've all long wondered about what are really the full semantics of artes liberales, right? What's going on there? But either of you have any thoughts about section 23, where Seneca writes, that really struck my attention, got my attention. Solae autem liberales sunt immo dicam verius liberae, quibus curae virtus est. So he seems to be coining this new phrase. So not just artes liberales, but artes liberae. Any of you have any initial thoughts about that? That's section 23.
You can react to this, of course, either Serafina or Ed.
I would say I would definitely defer to Serafina on this, since her reading is the first time I've looked at this particular angle in the text. But I think my initial reaction is that free in particular is this idea of like virtue sets you free from constraints, and therefore you can, in a way, like liberate yourself, to go to that image that Serafina used in 34. The soul kind of elevating itself out of a prison. But again, I definitely would defer to Serafina on this.
I must say, I mean, I must have read this. This is the first time I pay attention to it. So thank you, Craig, for fishing that out.
I mean, that's the next step would be to see, is this phrase, is this collocation ever attested anywhere else? Artes liberae, or is this really a coinage?
If, I'm not a Latinist, but would you say that in terms of what is doing with the language there, what is basically trying to do, that is, they're not just of the free in a sense, but they themselves free.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's kind of reifying those forms of knowledge. And it's interesting because that would have implications for this connection between the people level and the knowledge level, because it's in fact trying to make them into something that can exist on its own, almost without the people actually practicing them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, interesting.
And if that's what it's trying to do, then that's interesting, because any move towards the abstract, I now come to think I'm thinking in very mathematical terms here, but to me, a move towards the abstraction in mathematics rather than the concrete is also a kind of power move, as we were saying earlier, in social terms. Because the abstraction is tends to be a prerogative of a certain group of people with certain characteristics, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, linguistically, so I'm really just thinking aloud, but artes liberae makes it that much closer to homines liberi, right?
Yeah, that's
sorry.
Yeah. Serafina, you can talk.
Oh, sorry, I wanted Cristiana to talk.
I don't know. Oh, it's Cristiana.
No,
sorry.
Cristiana,
I think we're all muted.
No, I'm sorry. I'm having problem with my muting and unmuting clearly. No, I just wanted to say I mean, what Craig, I think, was saying about hominis liberi, or Serafina, now I don't remember who, hominis liberi and artis liberi. I mean, that's that was really what I was thinking, like the personifying the artist to the exclusion, and therefore excluding a certain group of people from participating in them in some, or making the artist actually personified, so they are like free people. They're born free, kind of. I found that image that Greg was suggesting just very, very interesting, and I had the same impression. That's all I wanted to say, so nothing especially useful.
Thank you, Cristiana. And now, Serafina, you were...
It occurred to me that when Ed was talking about accounts, I was thinking that I don't know that Seneca talks about accounts that much. Certainly not as much as Cicero does. So I know, I mean, they're obviously very different and so on, but it's fascinating how obsessed Cicero is with accounts. The moment you start looking for accounts, then you find a lot of them, which you don't find. So yeah, and there's this very ambiguous attitude where he wants to show that if he wants to, do accounting, of course he can do accounting. He can even be good at, like, doing accounts, understanding other people's accounts. But then in real life, there are a lot of mentions of accountants who are other people who do his accounts. And so this whole dynamic is there in Cicero in a much more explicit way. But I guess that, Seneca must have had accounts and accounting as well, except it's not so much on the surface as it is for Cicero, for the kind of different configurations of political life in their respective contexts, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that accounting would be way more complicated in the time of, I mean, the accounting for these people in the first century is like super complicated because the accounts are based on like an empire-wide structure, right? So I think honestly, most of these senators probably could not have understood how their money actually is generated and where it is. And but they fundamentally, if we want to talk about a hierarchy of knowledge, there are people who possess knowledge that's super important that these senators depend on, and they have no idea even how to access the kinds of technologies and tools that those people are using. And so I think that that's actually kind of locked into what Seneca is saying at the very beginning too, right? Is that, yeah, there's actually a lot of knowledge here. It's not just like I can sit there and add things up or physically count things that I just don't have the time for it. It's, I would need to learn how to do this, and I don't want to learn how to do this.
Yeah, so I must say we are approaching the end of our little hour, and before closing this, I would like yet to, to say something in favor of poor Seneca. That after all, I mean, he does say something right from my perspective, which is also very actualizing. That. You have so many people spending time like with stupid things and totally secondary aspects in our work. I mean, of course, Seneca is not going in that direction. I do understand that there is a major project beyond that, but still, I do like this detail. I say, come on, guys, please don't bother. I mean, studying all this very minutiae. They don't bring anything. They are totally unuseful. And I do feel, to be honest with you, when I go to conferences and so on, I'm sometimes really surprised that people could even spend time discussing, debating around really totally insignificant details. Sorry to be that, how do you say, shameless in this case. We are a small brand, but of course this video has been recorded, this Binomio has been recorded, so everybody who will look at it will listen to this final tirade. But in any case, I don't know if Nina would like to say something, because you make yourself visible. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I want to thank you both for a very interesting reading. I've been reading some Seneca in the context of my project, where I focus more on what he has to say about like also otium, negotium, things of how that relates to older age as well, and how people should sort of fit their lives around then for him the knowledge of philosophy. And it did struck me with some of the things you said, Serafina, also with this freedom. In other letters, he also very much stresses how it's in the otium, right, that the acquiring of knowledge happens. And of course, the knowledge that he appreciates is indeed only philosophy, which is very much highlighted in this letter as well. And also made me think about that, about like the accessibility of knowledge, which was very limited. If we think about like social cultural realities of the time, that not everyone had the opportunity to have this otium and to have access to the resources they needed to acquire philosophical knowledge for him then. So yeah, that's a very interesting way to look at it. Also, the marginalizing of people on the basis of the kind of knowledge they possess or the kind of abilities they have also made me sort of think about that when we look at, you know, strata of society. So I think it was very interesting. And Ed, of course, as you said, I think in Belgium as well, it made me think a lot about how people and students who study Latin and Greek constantly have to sort of justify themselves. It's very funny because in the educational masters that I also did at Ghent, there is one of the tasks for the exam is really to have a debate on the good sides of studying classics and studying Latin. And yes, a lot of your arguments made me also think about that. And we should actually maybe also look at Seneca and say, like, you know, they were thinking about that 2000 years ago, and we still do. And this sort of marginalizing of the humanities and classics and things like studying poetry or looking at text and literature is still something that in our contemporary society gets, you know, focused on even more, because it all has to be about what can you do with it, because that's a question we get asked most of the time as well. Like, okay, you study classics, but what do you do with it? So yeah, I think your presentation showed wonderfully how contemporary and that debate still is, and how we should continue to sort of fight for what we do, and indeed just ignore Seneca when he says that humanities suck, because they don't.
Thank you so much, Nina, for this final wrap up, really. And thank you, of course, both Serafina and Ed for this fantastic discussion. Also, thank you, Christiana, thank you, Craig, and thank you, I mean, those who were present. And let me wish you all the best for, you know, Christmas and the New Year. And I hope to see you soon with starting, I mean, the next series will be starting TITUBANTI TESTI 9 in February. And this is going to be also a very rich list of super interesting texts and speakers. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
See you soon.
Have a nice
guys.
holiday, everyone.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye
care,
bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye. Ciao. Ciao.